Nancy and Eze were the epitome of ambition. Both in their late 20s, they worked tirelessly to provide a bright future for their family. Nancy, a marketing executive, juggled late-night campaigns, while Eze, an engineer, spent long hours on construction sites. Their lives were a whirlwind of deadlines and meetings, leaving little time for their 6-month-old son, baby Josh. Guilt weighed heavily on Nancy as she kissed baby Josh goodbye each morning, his big brown eyes watching her leave. Eze, equally torn, would promise himself to spend more time with his family, a promise he never seemed able to keep. They both agreed they needed help. After much deliberation, they hired Nkem, a quiet and seemingly kind young woman, to care for their son. Nkem came highly recommended. She greeted them with a warm smile and spoke softly, assuring the couple she would treat baby Josh like her own. Relieved, Nancy and Eze placed their trust in her, hopeful she was the solution to their overwhelming responsibilities. The first few days seemed perfect. Nkem hummed lullabies as she rocked baby Josh to sleep, and the house felt more peaceful. "She's a blessing," Nancy said one evening as she watched Nkem feed baby Josh his formula. Eze nodded in agreement, feeling like they had made the right choice. Little did they know, Nkem's true nature would soon emerge, shattering their fragile peace. As soon as Nancy and Eze left for work, Nkem's demeanor shifted. The sweet smile she wore disappeared, replaced by an expression of irritation. Baby Josh, who had grown accustomed to his parents' affectionate care, cried often, reaching for comfort that never came. Nkem's patience wore thin quickly. She ignored his wails, scrolling through her phone instead. Hours passed, and baby Josh's cries turned into desperate, hiccuping sobs. "Such a spoiled baby," Nkem muttered under her breath. One afternoon, as baby Josh cried louder than usual, Nkem slammed her phone on the table. "Why can't you just stop?" she snapped, her voice echoing through the house. Picking him up roughly, she hissed, "Your parents think you're an angel, but you're nothing but trouble." She would beat him as though she's beating a grown-up child. Despite her harsh words, Nkem put on a pleasant facade whenever Nancy and Eze returned home. "He was so good today," she would say, handing over the baby with a forced smile. Nancy and Eze, exhausted from their day, never suspected a thing. But baby Josh's nightly cries grew more distressed, and his once joyful demeanor began to fade. Something was wrong, and the tiny cracks in Nkem's act were beginning to show. The day began like any other. Nancy kissed baby Josh on the forehead, whispering promises to return soon. Eze gave a quick hug, adjusting his tie as he rushed out the door. Nkem waved cheerfully from the doorway, the picture of a caring maid. But as soon as the door clicked shut, her smile vanished. Baby Josh, sensing his parents' absence, began to cry. The sound grated on Nkem's nerves, each sob feeling like an accusation. She tried to ignore him, scrolling through her phone, but his cries grew louder, more insistent. "Enough!" she shouted, slamming her phone onto the table. She marched over to the crib, her face a mask of frustration. Lifting baby Josh roughly, she glared at him. "You think you're the boss here?" she hissed. Baby Josh's cries only grew more frantic, his tiny hands reaching out for comfort. In a fit of anger, Nkem raised her hand and slapped his cheek. The sharp sound echoed through the room, and baby Josh froze, his cries replaced by stunned silence. For a moment, even Nkem seemed shocked by her actions, but instead of remorse, she sneered. "There, quiet at last," she muttered, placing him back in his crib without care. Baby Josh's tiny body trembled.
For everyone who is asking about how to create folktale stories like this and get their channels monetized in 30 days, like I got this channel monetized in exactly 24 days from scratch without ads or any paid collaboration, click the link in the description of this video or in the pinned comment to learn how to do same. Let's continue our story.
His wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He didn't understand why the gentle hands that once soothed him had turned so cruel. The once warm and safe world he knew had been replaced by cold indifference. The first incident marked the beginning of a nightmare, one that baby Josh was too small to escape or even comprehend. The following day, Nkem's frustration boiled over again. Baby Josh's cries seemed endless, each one gnawing at her already thin patience. She had grown tired of the sound, tired of the responsibility she had willingly taken on, but now resented. This time, she grabbed a nylon bag from the kitchen, her face set with cold determination. Returning to the crib, she glared down at baby Josh, who was red-faced and sobbing. "You want to scream all day?" she snapped. "Fine, let's see how you like this." She unfolded the nylon and, in one horrifying motion, placed it over baby Josh's face. The cries muffled instantly, replaced by panicked gasps as he struggled to breathe. His tiny hands flailed, grasping at the suffocating material, but Nkem held it firmly in place. "You'll learn to be quiet," she said, her voice eerily calm while she continued to press the nylon on the baby's face. Minutes felt like hours as baby Josh's struggles weakened. Finally, Nkem pulled the bag away, tossing it aside as though it were nothing. Baby Josh gasped for air, his cries now weak and pitiful. Nkem leaned over him, her eyes cold and devoid of remorse. "See? Quiet is better," she muttered before walking away, leaving baby Josh trembling and alone in his crib. That night, when Nancy returned home, she noticed something was off. Baby Josh seemed unusually quiet, his eyes wide and fearful. "Is everything okay?" she asked Nkem, who smiled sweetly. "He's been perfect, as always," Nkem lied effortlessly. But the truth was far darker than Nancy could have imagined, and it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Nkem's cruelty deepened with each passing day. Her patience was non-existent, and baby Josh's cries, which once signaled his need for comfort, now seemed like a personal affront to her. She viewed his every whimper as an annoyance, and her responses grew more severe. One afternoon, baby Josh began crying after Nkem roughly set him down in his crib. His cries were louder and more distressed than usual, piercing through the air like an alarm. Nkem clenched her fists, her face twisting in anger. "You just don't know when to stop, do you?" she snapped. Storming into the kitchen, she grabbed a piece of cloth and returned to the nursery. Baby Josh, still crying, didn't see her approach. Nkem snatched him up and sat him on the floor with a harsh jolt. "If you won't stop on your own, I'll make you stop." With chilling precision, she tied the cloth tightly around baby Josh's tiny mouth, muffling his cries. His wide, tear-filled eyes stared at her, a mixture of fear and confusion. He struggled against the restraint, his little hands tugging at the cloth, but Nkem pushed them away with a scowl. "There, peace at last," she muttered, setting him back in his crib. She ignored his muffled sobs and left the room, slamming the door behind her. Hours passed, and baby Josh remained tied up, his cries reduced to faint whimpers. He was exhausted, his tiny body trembling with fear and fatigue. That evening, when Nancy returned home, she found baby Josh unusually subdued. She attributed it to tiredness and carried him to bed, unaware of the horrors he had endured that day. But a neighbor, Mrs. Owusu, had begun noticing strange behavior, and her suspicions were growing. Mrs. Owusu lived next door to Nancy and Eze, her modest home sharing a thin wall with theirs. A retired teacher, she spent most of her days tending to her garden or knitting by the window. Having no children of her own, she had taken an interest in baby Josh since the day he was born. She often waved at him through the window and smiled at his happy coos. But over the past week, things had changed. Baby Josh's cries, once a regular and healthy sound of life, had grown less frequent. When he did cry, it sounded desperate, almost as if something were wrong. The cheerful hum of lullabies from the Maid and Nkem had vanished, replaced by long stretches of silence. One afternoon, as Mrs. Owusu watered her plants, she glanced over the fence and noticed Nkem sitting on the porch with her phone, completely engrossed in scrolling. It wasn't unusual to see her there, but this time something caught her eye. Baby Josh's cries drifted faintly through the open window, yet Nkem made no move to check on him. Frowning, Mrs. Owusu set down her watering can and moved closer to the fence. "Is everything all right, Nkem?" she called. Nkem startled, quickly plastering on a fake smile. "Oh, yes, ma'am. The baby is fine, just a little fussy." Mrs. Owusu nodded, but didn't believe her. Something about Nkem's tone felt wrong. The young woman's evasive behavior only deepened her unease. The next day, the silence was deafening. Mrs. Owusu didn't hear Baby Josh at all. Anxiety gnawed at her, and she decided to investigate further. Peering through the curtains, she saw Nkem rush out of the house with an annoyed expression, slamming the door behind her. The quiet that followed was unsettling. Something was deeply wrong, and Mrs. Owusu resolved to find out what. Determined to uncover the truth, Mrs. Owusu spent the evening pacing her living room. She couldn't shake the image of Nkem's cold, detached expression or the unnatural silence in Nancy and Eze's home. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, and she decided she couldn't stand idly by. The next morning, under the guise of borrowing sugar, she knocked on Nancy's door. As expected, Nkem answered, her usual forced smile in place. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "Oh, just need some sugar. You know how it is," Mrs. Owusu replied, pretending to peer past Nkem into the house. She caught a glimpse of Baby Josh lying unusually still in his crib. Her heart tightened. As Nkem fetched the sugar, Mrs. Owusu glanced around the hallway. Her sharp eyes fell on a corner table holding a vase. It was the perfect spot for a hidden camera, she thought. With a silent prayer, she resolved to act quickly. That evening, under the cover of darkness, she slipped out of her home and approached Nancy's house. She had purchased a small, discreet hidden camera earlier that day, using money she had saved for emergencies. "If this isn't an emergency, I don't know what is," she whispered to herself. Her hands trembled as she secured the camera behind the vase. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart race, but she pressed on. She adjusted the lens to capture the living room and part of the nursery door. Satisfied, she slipped back to her home, her heart pounding. For the next few days, she reviewed the footage obsessively. What she saw chilled her to the bone. Nkem's neglect, her harsh words, and finally the unspeakable moment when she tied Baby Josh's mouth with a cloth. Tears streamed down Mrs. Owusu's face as she watched. She had the proof she needed, but how would she confront Nancy and Eze without breaking their hearts? The footage played on Mrs. Owusu's laptop, each second more horrifying than the last. She watched as Nkem ignored Baby Josh's cries, her face a mask of irritation. But it was what followed that made her stomach churn. In one clip, Nkem slapped Baby Josh's tiny face, his startled cries piercing the air. In another, she used a nylon bag to silence him, leaving him gasping for air. The final video showed her tying a cloth around his mouth, rendering him helpless and muffled. Mrs. Owusu covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could anyone be so cruel?" she whispered. Baby Josh's wide, fearful eyes and desperate struggles haunted her. This wasn't just neglect, it was abuse. Her first instinct was to storm into Nancy and Eze's home and confront Nkem. But she hesitated. What if Nkem denied everything? What if Nancy and Eze didn't believe her? She needed to be strategic. The next morning, she called Nancy. "Dear, can I come over this evening? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Nancy, though surprised, agreed. That evening, when Nancy and Eze returned home, Mrs. Owusu arrived with her laptop. Her face was grave, her usual warm demeanor replaced with urgency. "Please sit down," she said, her voice heavy. "I need to show you something." As the footage played, Nancy and Eze's expressions shifted from confusion to horror. Nancy let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth in disbelief. Eze's fists clenched, his face taut with rage. When the video ended, the room fell into stunned silence. Nancy broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. How could she? My baby. Eze stood abruptly. She's done. She's leaving this house tonight. The truth was out, and justice would not be far behind. Nancy couldn't stop shaking as she replayed the footage in her mind. Her baby, her sweet, innocent baby Josh, had suffered unimaginable torment at the hands of someone she had trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than words could express. Beside her, Eze paced the living room, his jaw tight and his hands balled into fists. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by a storm of rage and guilt. How could we not have seen this? Nancy sobbed, clutching baby Josh to her chest. He whimpered softly, as if sensing his mother's distress. We left him with her, thinking he was safe. Eze stopped pacing and knelt beside her. We'll fix this, Nancy, he said firmly, though his voice trembled. We'll make sure she pays for what she's done. But first, we need to get Josh checked out. Nancy nodded, wiping her tears as she packed a small bag for the baby. Eze called the hospital to inform them of the situation. We'll need a full examination, he told the nurse on the line, his voice strained. As they prepared to leave, Nkem entered the living room, oblivious to what had transpired. Good evening, sir, ma'am, she greeted with her usual fake smile. Eze turned to her, his eyes blazing. Pack your things, Nkem. You're leaving this house tonight. Nkem froze, her smile faltering. What do you mean? Nancy stood, her voice shaking with fury. We know what you did to our son. Don't you dare deny it. Panic flashed across Nkem's face. She stammered, I don't understand. Save it, Eze cut her off. Leave now before we call the police. Nkem, realizing she was caught, fled to her room to pack. Moments later, she was gone, leaving the house silent except for baby Josh's soft whimpers. At the hospital, the doctors reassured Nancy and Eze that baby Josh was physically unharmed but emotionally shaken. The couple vowed never to leave him with anyone they didn't trust implicitly again. Justice, however, was still waiting. They weren't done with Nkem yet.
All right, so what did you learn from this story? Share it in the comment section. And please subscribe to this channel right now and turn on post notification so that whenever a story is posted, you'll be the first to get notified and you'll be the first to watch.